The dust kicked up from the rodeo arena hung thick in the Wyoming air as Jake Morrison watched from the shadows behind the bleachers. He'd come to Copper Falls to disappear, to leave his past as a federal marshal buried 6 feet deep alongside his partner who'd died in his arms. Just another drifter now, another face in the crowd. That's when he saw it. The ranch hand's whip crack across the Mustang's flank, the animal's eyes rolling white with terror. The crowd cheered. Jake's blood turned to ice. "You enjoy hitting horses?" Jake's voice cut through the noise like a blade. The ranch hand turned, smirking at the lean stranger in worn jeans. "What's it to you, drifter?" Jake stepped into the arena's spotlight, his hand moving to his hip in a motion that made 3 men in the crowd suddenly reach for concealed weapons. They recognized that stance. They knew that face from wanted posters that said extremely dangerous. The Mustang's life wasn't the only thing hanging in the balance. Jake's carefully constructed new identity was about to explode. But what was his real plan, and why did those men seem so terrified to see him alive? The ranch hand, a bull of a man named Colt Brennan, laughed and spit tobacco juice into the dirt. "This here's my horse, stranger. I'll handle it how I see fit." He raised the whip again, and the Mustang flinched backward, nostrils flaring. Jake's jaw tightened. The animal reminded him of the horses he'd ridden during his martial days, proud, spirited creatures that deserved respect, not brutality. His partner Danny had always said you could judge a man's character by how he treated animals and children. Danny was gone now, killed in a shootout that still haunted Jake's dreams. "Drop the whip," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying despite the ambient noise of the crowd. Something in his tone made nearby conversations falter. Colt's smirk widened. "Or what, cowboy?" In the stands, Sheriff Tom Hartley felt his blood run cold. That voice, that stance, he'd heard about Jake Morrison from federal bulletins. The man was supposed to be dead, killed in a firefight with the Valdez cartel 6 months ago. Yet here he stood, very much alive and looking like trouble incarnate. 2 other men in the crowd shifted nervously. Marcus Webb, a bounty hunter who'd been tracking Morrison for weeks, slowly reached inside his jacket. Next to him, Luis Montoya, one of the few surviving members of the Valdez organization, whispered urgently into a cell phone. They'd all believed Morrison was dead. His reappearance meant loose ends that certain people couldn't afford. The Mustang whinnied, a sound of pure distress that cut through Jake like a knife. The animal was young, maybe 3 years old, with a coat the color of storm clouds and eyes that spoke of broken trust. "I'm not asking again," Jake said, taking another step forward. His hand hovered near his hip, though no weapon was visible. The crowd had gone mostly silent now, sensing the tension crackling between the 2 men like electricity before a lightning strike. Colt looked around at the faces watching him, his authority being challenged in front of half the town. "You picked the wrong fight, mister." He cracked the whip in Jake's direction, not quite hitting him but close enough to make a statement. Jake moved faster than anyone expected. One moment he was standing 10 feet away. The next he had Colt's wrist locked in an iron grip, the whip falling useless to the ground. The ranch hand was a big man, but Jake's training ran deeper than size and muscle. It was carved into his bones by years of facing killers and walking away alive. "Let me go, you son of a—" Colt's words cut off as Jake applied pressure to a nerve cluster that sent lightning bolts of pain up his arm. "The horse walks away unharmed," Jake said conversationally, as if he wasn't currently immobilizing a man 30 pounds heavier than himself. "You walk away unharmed. Everyone's happy." In the stands, Marcus Webb made his decision. His hand closed around the grip of his concealed pistol. The bounty on Jake Morrison, dead or alive, was worth more than he'd make in 5 years of legitimate work. The federal marshals wanted him for allegedly selling classified information to the cartels. Marcus didn't much care about guilt or innocence. He cared about the $100,000 payday. Sheriff Hartley saw Webb's movement and started pushing through the crowd. Whatever Morrison had allegedly done, Hartley wasn't about to let his town turn into a shooting gallery. Luis Montoya finished his phone call and began moving toward the exit. His orders were simple: confirm Morrison was alive and report back. Others would handle the wet work. The Mustang, sensing the shift in atmosphere, had stopped its panic dancing. It watched Jake with intelligent dark eyes, as if recognizing a kindred spirit, another creature that had known violence but chose a different path. Jake released Colt's wrist and stepped back, his hands visible but ready. "Smart choice," he said as the ranch hand retreated, cradling his arm. But Jake's peripheral vision caught the glint of metal in the stands, and he knew his peaceful new life had just ended before it truly began. The man's boots hit the ground like thunder as he vaulted over the arena fence, his weathered duster billowing behind him. The crowd's cheers died in their throats, replaced by an electric tension that crackled through the evening air. Dust swirled around his legs as he approached the fallen horse, and for a moment the only sounds were the animal's labored breathing and the distant hum of stadium lights. "Sir, you need to get back behind the barrier," called out one of the arena workers, jogging toward him with uncertainty evident in every step. The stranger didn't acknowledge him, didn't even turn his head. His attention was fixed entirely on the horse, whose dark eyes rolled white with pain and terror. Buck Morrison, the rodeo manager, pushed through the gate and strode across the arena with the authority of a man who'd been running these shows for 20 years. His face was flushed red beneath his white Stetson, whether from anger or embarrassment, nobody could tell. "Mister, I don't know who you think you are, but you got no business down here." Buck's voice boomed across the arena, amplified by the curved walls. "This here's a private venue, and you're trespassing." The stranger finally looked up, and Buck felt his words die in his throat. The man's eyes were the color of winter sky, pale and cold and absolutely devoid of warmth. When he spoke, his voice carried, despite being barely above a whisper, each word crisp and deliberate. "This animal needs medical attention. Now." "That's our call to make," Buck shot back, but his bluster had lost some of its force. "We got procedures here, been doing this longer than you've been alive, I'd wager." The stranger rose slowly, unfolding to his full height like a blade being drawn from its sheath. He was taller than Buck had initially thought, and despite his lean build, something about his presence filled the space around him. Several of the arena workers had gathered now, forming a loose semicircle, but none seemed eager to get too close. "Your procedures," the stranger said, his gaze never leaving Buck's face, "just cost this horse 3 minutes of agony while you worried about liability and insurance." From the bleachers, Sheriff Tom Bradley watched the confrontation with growing unease. He'd been hoping to enjoy a quiet evening off, but his instincts were screaming that this situation was about to go sideways. The stranger moved with a peculiar grace, like a man accustomed to violence but comfortable enough with it that he didn't need to advertise the fact. "Look here, friend," Buck tried again, stepping closer and lowering his voice. "I appreciate your concern, I really do, but we can't have spectators jumping into the arena every time something goes wrong. Sets a bad precedent." The stranger tilted his head slightly, and for just a moment Buck caught a glimpse of something predatory in those pale eyes. "And what precedent does letting animals suffer set?" Behind him, the horse's breathing had grown more labored. A thin line of blood trickled from its nostril, dark against the tan coat. The stranger glanced back at the animal, and Buck saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "That's enough," Buck declared, his patience finally snapping. He gestured to his workers. "Boys, escort this gentleman back to his seat, forcibly if necessary." The nearest worker, a thick-set man named Carl with arms like tree trunks, stepped forward and reached for the stranger's shoulder. What happened next would be debated in Millfield for years to come, though everyone agreed on one thing: it was over before it began. Carl's hand never made contact. The stranger moved with fluid precision, catching the bigger man's wrist and using his own momentum against him. Carl found himself face down in the dirt before his brain could process what had happened. His arm twisted at an angle that made several spectators wince. The other workers froze, suddenly reconsidering their career choices. "Jesus Christ," Buck breathed, taking an involuntary step backward. The stranger released Carl's arm and straightened his collar with the casual air of a man who'd just swatted a fly. "The horse," he said simply, as if nothing had happened. "It has a punctured lung, probably from a broken rib. Without immediate treatment, it will die slowly and painfully." Sheriff Bradley was already making his way down from the stands, his hand resting on his service weapon, but not yet drawing it. Years of law enforcement had taught him to read people, and this man was dangerous in a way that went far beyond simple barroom brawling. In the arena, Buck Morrison found himself in uncharted territory. In 20 years of rodeo management, he'd dealt with drunk cowboys, angry animal rights protesters, and everything in between. But he'd never encountered someone who could put Carl down like a professional and then discuss veterinary medicine in the same breath. The crowd had gone completely silent now, sensing that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple disagreement about animal welfare. The crowd fell silent as Jake's words echoed across the arena. Even the cicadas seemed to pause their endless drone. Marcus felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on him, studying his pressed khakis and polo shirt like they were reading a foreign language. Sheriff Tom Bradley pushed through the crowd, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. He'd seen plenty of troublemakers over his 23 years wearing the badge, but something about this stranger set his teeth on edge. The man stood perfectly still, yet radiated the kind of coiled tension Tom had only encountered twice before, both times involving military veterans who'd seen too much combat. "Now hold on there, Jake," Tom called out, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man used to diffusing volatile situations. "Let's all take a step back and breathe." Jake spat tobacco juice into the dirt, never taking his eyes off Marcus. "Sheriff, this city boy here thinks he can come into our town and tell us how to run our business. Maybe you ought to escort him back to whatever fancy hotel he's staying at." Marcus tilted his head slightly, and Tom caught something flickering across his features, a micro-expression that vanished before he could properly identify it. But it reminded him of a rattlesnake, deciding whether to strike or retreat. "I don't want any trouble," Marcus said quietly. His voice carried a strange quality, like distant thunder rolling across the plains. "I just think there are better ways to handle animals." "Better ways?" Jake's laugh was harsh and ugly. "Boy, I've been working cattle and horses since before you were sucking on your mama's tit. You probably never even seen a horse up close, except in some fancy riding stable." The crowd murmured agreement, sensing blood in the water. Tom noticed how they'd unconsciously formed a loose circle around the two men, creating an impromptu arena. Small-town entertainment was hard to come by, and this was shaping up to be better than the rodeo itself. But Tom also noticed how Marcus positioned himself. Weight distributed evenly, hands loose at his sides, eyes constantly tracking the crowd's movement. The sheriff had seen plenty of bar fights and domestic disputes, but this felt different, dangerous in a way that made his pulse quicken. "Jake, why don't you get back to your beer?" Tom suggested. "And sir, maybe you'd like to—" "No." Marcus's voice cut through the suggestion like a blade. "He's right about one thing. I haven't spent my life working with horses." He paused, and when he continued, his words carried a weight that made several people step backward involuntarily. "But I've seen enough suffering to recognize it, and I've seen enough cruelty to know it when I see it." Dr. Sarah Chen pushed through the crowd, her veterinary bag clutched in her white-knuckled grip. She'd been treating the injured horse when the commotion started, and something about the stranger's demeanor made her professional instincts scream warnings. "The horse will be fine," she announced, hoping to diffuse whatever was building between the two men. "Just needs rest and proper care." Jake rounded on her with alcoholic fury. "Nobody asked you, China girl. Maybe you ought to stick to treating poodles for rich ladies instead of telling ranchers how to handle livestock." The slur hung in the air like smoke, and Sarah felt the familiar sting of racism she'd endured since moving to this town 5 years ago. But before she could respond, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Marcus had gone completely still, not the frozen stillness of fear or shock, but the terrible quiet of a predator selecting its prey. His breathing hadn't changed, his posture remained relaxed, but something fundamental had shifted in his bearing. Sarah had spent years studying animal behavior, and every instinct told her she was looking at an apex predator. Jake. Marcus spoke the name like he was tasting something bitter. "That's your name, right?" "That's right, city boy. Jake Morrison. My family's been ranching this land for 4 generations. What's your name so I know what to put on the marker?" The threat drew nervous laughter from the crowd, but Tom felt his hand inch closer to his weapon. He'd served 2 tours in Iraq before becoming sheriff, and he recognized the signs of imminent violence. The air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation. Marcus smiled then, and it was the most frightening expression Tom had ever seen on a human face. It held no warmth, no humor, just the cold promise of consequences. "My name," Marcus said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "is Marcus Quinn." The name meant nothing to most of the crowd, but Tom saw recognition flicker across a few faces, older men who read military journals and followed news from overseas conflicts. Their expressions shifted from amusement to something approaching fear. "Now, Jake," Marcus continued, taking a single step forward, "I think you owe the lady an apology." The ambulance sirens faded into the distance, carrying what remained of Buck Morrison to the county hospital. Sheriff Pete Hawkins stood in the settling dust of the arena, watching the mysterious stranger who'd turned his quiet Saturday into a nightmare. The man sat perfectly still on the bleacher steps, his weathered hands resting calmly on his knees as if he hadn't just nearly killed someone with his bare hands. "Name," Hawkins said, pulling out his notepad with more authority than he felt. "Cole Brennan." The voice was steady, almost conversational. Hawkins scribbled it down, noting how the stranger, Cole, didn't fidget or avoid eye contact like most folks did when the law came calling. This one had been through questioning before. "You from around here, Mr. Brennan?" "Passing through." "To where?" Cole's pale eyes fixed on the sheriff, nowhere in particular. Doc Martinez approached, medical bag in hand, shaking his head. "Buck's in bad shape, Pete. Real bad. Multiple fractures, possible internal bleeding. That boy might not walk right again, if he walks at all." The weight of those words settled over the small crowd that remained. Most folks had scattered when the ambulance arrived, but a core group lingered, curiosity warring with caution. Among them stood Marcus Webb, his expensive boots incongruous with the dirt and hay. "Sheriff," Webb interjected, his voice carrying the authority of money, "I think we need to discuss what really happened here. Buck Morrison is one of our finest competitors. This stranger attacked him without provocation." Cole's laugh was soft and humorless. "Without provocation. You got something to say about that?" Hawkins asked. "I saw what I saw." Cole gestured toward the arena where a few hands were still tending to the injured horse. "Your finest competitor was working that animal over with spurs filed to points. Horse was bleeding before it ever left the chute." "That's a damn lie," Webb snapped. "Buck rides clean, always has." Doc Martinez cleared his throat. "Actually, Pete, I did notice some unusual markings on that bronc, cuts that looked fresh. Could be from spurs, I suppose." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a bad cigarette. Hawkins felt the familiar weight of small-town politics pressing down on him. Webb owned half the businesses in town and sponsored the rodeo. Buck Morrison brought in crowds and prize money. And here was this stranger, this nobody from nowhere, threatening to upset the whole apple cart. "Even if that's true," Hawkins said carefully, "you can't just beat a man half to death over it. We got laws here, procedures." Cole stood up, and despite his lean frame, there was something in the movement that made everyone take a step back. Laws. He rolled the word around like it tasted bitter. "You enforce those laws when it comes to animal cruelty, Sheriff? You investigate complaints? File charges?" The question hit closer to home than Hawkins liked. The truth was, most folks around here saw animals as property, nothing more. Complaints were rare, investigations rarer still. But he couldn't admit that, not in front of half the town. We handle things appropriate to the situation, he said. Appropriate. Cole nodded slowly. See, that's where we differ. I find a man torturing an animal for sport. I handle it immediate and permanent. There was something in the way he said it that sent ice down Hawkins' spine. This wasn't some drifter with a temper. This was a man who'd made violence into an art form. Young Sarah Chen had been quiet through most of the exchange, but now she stepped forward. Mr. Brennan's right about the horse. I saw the blood too, but I was afraid to say anything. Buck's got friends, and my family... She trailed off, but the implication was clear. Webb's face darkened. You watch your mouth, girl. Your daddy's got debts all over town. Wouldn't want those coming due early. The threat was barely veiled, and Cole's demeanor shifted like a storm front moving in. The casual stillness became something predatory, dangerous. Now that, Cole said quietly, sounds like a threat against a young lady. Sheriff, you planning to handle that appropriate to the situation? Hawkins found himself caught between forces he didn't fully understand. Webb's money kept the town running, but this stranger radiated a kind of danger that made the sheriff's survival instincts scream warnings. Marcus, maybe you should head on home, Hawkins suggested. Let me sort this out. Webb looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Cole's pale stare convinced him otherwise. He stalked away, but not before pointing a finger at Sarah. This ain't over, girl. Your family will remember this day. As Webb's truck roared to life and disappeared down the dirt road, Cole turned his attention back to the sheriff. You going to arrest me? It was a simple question with complicated answers. Hawkins looked at this dangerous stranger and wondered what other secrets lay buried behind those watchful eyes. The dust hadn't even settled when Jake Morrison felt the first tremor of recognition crawl up his spine. 23 years as Millbrook's sheriff had taught him to read people like weather patterns, and everything about this stranger screamed danger. Not the kind that came with raised voices and clenched fists, but something far worse, the controlled, calculated menace of a man who'd learned to kill without thinking twice. Jake pushed through the scattered crowd, his hand instinctively checking his service weapon. The stranger stood motionless in the center of the chaos, blood on his knuckles, his breathing steady despite having just demolished 3 grown men in under 30 seconds. What bothered Jake most wasn't the violence. He'd seen plenty of barroom brawls turn ugly. It was the clinical precision, the way each strike had been delivered with surgical intent. "That's enough!" Jake called out, his voice carrying the authority of decades in law enforcement. "Everyone just calm down." The stranger turned, and Jake found himself looking into eyes that belonged in a war zone, not a small-town rodeo. There was something familiar about the man's face, something that tugged at memories Jake couldn't quite place. The stranger's posture remained relaxed, but Jake recognized the coiled readiness of someone who could explode back into action without warning. "Sheriff Morrison," the stranger said, and Jake's blood went cold. He hadn't introduced himself, hadn't worn a name tag, but this man knew exactly who he was. "Do we know each other?" Jake asked, his hand now resting openly on his weapon. "Not personally." The stranger's voice carried a slight rasp, like someone who'd spent too many years breathing desert sand. "But I know your reputation. Heard you're a fair man." Before Jake could respond, Tommy Briggs chose that moment to struggle to his feet, blood streaming from his broken nose. "You're gonna pay for this, you freak! Nobody comes into my town and—" The stranger moved so fast Jake almost missed it. One moment Tommy was ranting, the next he was pressed against the fence, the stranger's forearm across his throat with just enough pressure to make breathing difficult. "Your town?" The stranger's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow everyone nearby heard every word. "You think because you own some property, because you wave around Daddy-S money, that gives you the right to torture animals for entertainment?" Jake stepped closer, recognizing the signs of a situation about to spiral completely out of control. "Let him go. We can sort this out without—" "Can we?" The stranger's eyes never left Tommy's face. "How many times has this piece of garbage done something like this? How many times have you sorted it out, Sheriff? How many warnings? How many slaps on the wrist? The question hit closer to home than Jake wanted to admit. Tommy Briggs had been a problem for years, drunk and disorderly, petty harassment, always skirting the edge of serious trouble but never quite crossing the line that would justify real consequences. His family's money and influence had greased too many wheels, bought too much silence. "That's not how the law works," Jake said, but even to his own ears it sounded weak. The law. The stranger almost smiled, and it was the most unsettling expression Jake had ever seen. "Tell me, Sheriff, what's the penalty around here for animal cruelty?" "Misdemeanor. Fine, maybe some community service. And for the 3 men whose bones I just rearranged." Jake felt the weight of every eye in the rodeo arena. Assault. Could be serious charges, depending on... So the animal gets justice measured in pocket change, but the men who stood up for it face real prison time. The stranger finally released Tommy, who collapsed to his knees, gasping. "That's an interesting interpretation of justice." Dr. Sarah Chen appeared at Jake's shoulder, her medical bag in hand. "Sheriff, I need to check these men for serious injuries." She looked at the stranger with a mixture of professional assessment and something else, curiosity, maybe even approval. That was quite a display. "Military training?" The stranger's expression shuttered completely. "Something like that." Jake caught the exchange and filed it away. This man wasn't just dangerous, he was trained dangerous, the kind of training that came with government paychecks and classified assignments. But there was something else, something in the way the stranger had reacted to the injured horse that suggested this was personal. "I need your name," Jake said, "for the report." "Marcus Cole." The stranger offered no other details, no explanation of where he'd come from or why he was in Millbrook. Jake pulled out his radio to call for backup and an ambulance, but his mind was already racing ahead to the phone calls he'd have to make. Because Marcus Cole, if that was even his real name, had just painted a target on himself that extended far beyond Tommy Briggs and his bruised ego. The Briggs family had connections that reached all the way to the state capital, and they didn't forgive public humiliation. More troubling still was Jake's growing certainty that he'd seen this man's face before, in contexts that had nothing to do with small-town rodeos. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty Main Street as Jake emerged from the diner, his movements deliberate and measured. The events of the previous night had spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire, and he could feel the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes following his every step, some curious, some fearful, all trying to reconcile the soft-spoken stranger who'd ordered coffee and eggs with the man who'd nearly killed Bobby Trent with his bare hands. Sheriff Morrison sat in his patrol car across the street, engine idling, his weathered face a mask of professional composure. Jake acknowledged him with a slight nod before turning toward the general store. He needed supplies, and despite the circumstances, life had a way of demanding the mundane alongside the extraordinary. Inside the store, the elderly proprietor, Henry Walsh, looked up from his newspaper with barely concealed apprehension. "Morning," he managed, his voice catching slightly. "Morning," Jake replied, selecting items from the shelves with practiced efficiency. Canned goods, jerky, ammunition for the rifle he'd left in his truck. Basic necessities for a man accustomed to traveling light and staying mobile. "You planning on staying long?" Henry asked, attempting casual conversation while his fingers drummed nervously on the counter. Jake paused, considering the question. He'd asked himself the same thing throughout a sleepless night in the motel room. Every instinct screamed at him to move on, to put Cedar Falls in his rearview mirror before the ripples of last night's violence spread any further. But something held him here, a magnetic pull he couldn't quite identify. "Haven't decided," he answered truthfully. The bell above the door chimed, and Dr. Sarah Chen stepped inside. She looked tired but determined, her medical bag slung over her shoulder. Her eyes met Jake's, and he saw something there that surprised him, not fear, but genuine concern. "I was hoping I'd find you," she said, approaching the counter. "We need to talk." Henry suddenly found urgent business in the back room. Leaving them alone, among the shelves of goods and the thick tension that seemed to follow Jake wherever he went. "About what?" Jake asked, though he suspected he knew. "About Bobby Trent. About what you did to him." Her voice was steady, professional, but Jake caught the underlying current of something else. "I've been a trauma surgeon for 15 years. I've seen combat wounds, car accidents, industrial accidents. But what you did to that man, that wasn't random violence. That was precision." Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was hurting an animal. "No," Sarah said, stepping closer. "He was hurting an animal, and you responded like someone who's done this before, like someone trained to inflict maximum damage with minimal effort." She paused, studying his face. "The question is, who trained you?" The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Outside, the normal sounds of small-town life continued, cars passing, dogs barking, children playing, but inside the store, the air felt charged with unspoken truths. "Does it matter?" Jake finally asked. "It does when there's a man lying in my clinic with injuries that tell a very specific story. And it does when the person responsible is walking around my town like a loaded weapon." Jake set down the can of beans he'd been holding, his movements careful and controlled. "Your town? I've lived here for 8 years. These people matter to me, and right now they're scared. They want to know if you're here to help or to hurt. And what do you think?" Sarah studied his face, taking in the weathered features, the eyes that held too many secrets, the way he held himself like a man perpetually ready for violence. "I think you're someone who's seen too much and done too much, and you're trying to figure out if there's any part of you left that's worth saving." The accuracy of her assessment hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd spent years running from that exact question, burying it under missions and objectives and the simple clarity of following orders. But here, in this small store in a town he'd stumbled into by accident, a woman he barely knew had stripped away all his carefully constructed defenses with surgical precision. "Maybe you should stick to medicine," he said, but there was no heat in the words. "Maybe you should stick around long enough to find out who you really are when you're not running." Before Jake could respond, the door burst open and Tommy Martinez rushed in, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Dr. Chen! Sheriff Morrison needs you at the clinic right now. There's been an accident out at the Hendricks Ranch. Someone cut the fence lines and spooked the cattle. 3 men are hurt and—" He paused, noticing Jake for the first time. "And Mr. Hendricks is saying it wasn't no accident. He's saying someone's sending a message." Sarah was already moving toward the door, but she stopped and looked back at Jake. "Coincidences are rare in towns this size," she said quietly. "The question is whether you're the cause of this trouble or the solution to it." The morning sun cast long shadows across the rodeo grounds as Jake's boots crunched through the gravel. The silence felt unnatural after yesterday's chaos. No cheering crowds, no announcer's voice, just the distant sound of cleanup crews dismantling what remained of the damaged bleachers. Sheriff Morrison stood near the main gate, radio crackling at his hip. When he spotted Jake approaching, his hand instinctively moved toward his weapon before he caught himself. The stranger's transformation from mild-mannered outsider to lethal force still haunted everyone who'd witnessed it. "Figured you'd be long gone by now," Morrison said, his voice carefully neutral. Jake stopped 10 feet away, maintaining the distance like a practiced negotiation. "Had some business to finish." "What kind of business?" Instead of answering, Jake nodded toward the livestock pens. "Horse still here?" Morrison's jaw tightened. The injured mare that had started everything remained in the veterinary trailer, her condition stabilized but uncertain. Doc Williams had worked through the night, refusing to give up on the animal that had become an unwitting symbol of the previous day's violence. "She's alive, if that's what you're asking." Jake's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Good." The 2 men stood in uncomfortable silence until Morrison's radio squawked with an update from the state police. Jake caught fragments: roadblocks, manhunt, dangerous fugitive. His mouth curved into something that might have been a smile under different circumstances. "They're looking for you pretty hard," Morrison observed. "They always are. You gonna tell me who you really are?" Jake studied the sheriff's weathered face, seeing something there that reminded him of better men he'd known in darker places. Does it matter? Might matter to the families of those boys you put in the hospital. Might matter to this town when the federal agents start asking questions they won't like the answers to. A dust devil spun across the empty arena, lifting discarded programs and debris into a miniature tornado before dissipating. Jake watched it with the same intensity he'd shown everything else, as if constantly calculating angles and exit strategies. "Tom Briggs is awake," Morrison continued. "Says you knew things about him, private things, things that scared him more than the beating you gave him." Jake's eyes sharpened. "What kind of things?" "The kind that make a man confess to crimes nobody knew he'd committed." Morrison stepped closer, emboldened by Jake's obvious interest. "Seems Tom's been supplementing his rodeo income with some questionable activities. Drug running, mostly. Small-time stuff, but enough to put him away for a while." The information hung between them like smoke. Jake processed it with the efficiency of someone accustomed to gathering intelligence from fragments and implications. "You think I'm law enforcement?" Jake said. It wasn't a question. "Are you?" "Not anymore." Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The distinction between law enforcement and something else, something potentially worse, opened possibilities he didn't want to explore. Then what? Before Jake could answer, a black SUV crested the hill approaching the rodeo grounds. Both men tensed, recognizing the deliberate pace of a vehicle whose occupants were already familiar with their destination. Jake's posture shifted subtly, weight balanced, hands free. "Expecting company?" he asked. Morrison shook his head, reaching for his radio. "All units, we have an unidentified vehicle approaching the fairgrounds. Black SUV, tinted windows, federal plates." The vehicle stopped 50 yards away. Doors opened with synchronized precision, revealing 3 figures in dark suits that screamed government despite the rural setting. Jake studied their formation, professional but not military, which told him everything he needed to know about their training and likely limitations. "Sheriff Morrison?" The lead agent's voice carried across the distance with bureaucratic authority. "Agent Sarah Chen, FBI. We need to discuss yesterday's incident." Morrison glanced at Jake, but the stranger had somehow vanished during the brief exchange. No sound, no movement, simply gone like morning mist touched by sunlight. The sheriff found himself staring at empty space where a dangerous man had stood moments before. Agent Chen approached with measured steps, her colleagues flanking her in a textbook formation that would have been impressive if their target hadn't already disappeared. Her eyes swept the immediate area with trained precision before settling on Morrison's troubled face. "We're looking for an individual who may have been involved in the disturbance here yesterday," she said. "Tall, dark hair, possibly traveling under an assumed name, goes by Jake." Morrison considered his options carefully. The stranger had saved an animal and exposed a criminal, but he'd also demonstrated capabilities that suggested a much larger and more dangerous story. The sheriff found himself at a crossroads between duty and instinct. "Can't say I recall anyone matching that description," he said finally. Agent Chen's expression suggested she didn't believe him, but before she could respond, a distant sound echoed across the empty rodeo grounds, the rumble of a motorcycle engine growing fainter by the second. The ambulance sirens faded into the distance, carrying Tommy Briggs toward what everyone hoped would be salvation. Sarah watched the red taillights disappear beyond the cottonwoods, her medical bag still clutched in her blood-stained hands. The rodeo grounds had transformed into something resembling a crime scene, with Sheriff Morrison's deputies stringing yellow tape around the announcer's booth where Tommy had fallen. "Doc, you did everything you could," Morrison said, approaching her with heavy steps. His usual swagger had been replaced by the grim determination of a man facing something far beyond a typical Saturday night disturbance. Sarah nodded absently, her mind still processing the precision of violence she'd witnessed. The stranger hadn't just beaten Tommy, he'd systematically dismantled him with surgical efficiency. Every strike had been calculated, purposeful, designed to incapacitate rather than kill. That level of control spoke to training she didn't want to contemplate. "Have you found him?" she asked. Morrison's jaw tightened, vanished like smoke, but nobody disappears that completely without help. He gestured toward the dispersing crowd. "Half these folks are lying about what they saw, and the other half are too scared to talk straight." Mayor Hawthorne materialized beside them, his campaign smile nowhere to be found. "Sheriff, we need to discuss damage control. The regional news crews will be here by morning and—" "Damage control?" Sarah rounded on him. "A man nearly died tonight. Your priority should be finding who did it." "My priority is protecting this town's reputation and economy," Hawthorne shot back. "That rodeo brings in 60% of our annual tourism revenue. If word spreads that we can't maintain basic security—" "Maybe we can't," Morrison interrupted. "Maybe we've been playing at law enforcement while real predators circle." The mayor's face flushed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Before Morrison could respond, Deputy Martinez jogged over, slightly out of breath. "Sheriff, you need to see this." He held up a military-style knife in an evidence bag. "Found it buried under the bleachers. Still has blood on it." Sarah examined the weapon through the plastic. The blade was matte black, serrated along one edge, with markings she couldn't identify. This wasn't used on Tommy. His injuries were all blunt force trauma. "Then why hide it?" Morrison asked. "Insurance," said a voice behind them. They turned to find Frank Garrison approaching, his weathered face etched with concern. The old rancher moved with the careful steps of a man whose joints had endured too many hard seasons. "Frank," Morrison acknowledged. "Thought you'd headed home." "Was fixing to, until I saw Martinez poking around where my grandson likes to hide during the boring events." Garrison's eyes fixed on the knife. "That's not some gas station special, Sheriff. That's military issue, the kind they don't hand out to weekend warriors." "How would you know?" Hawthorne demanded. Garrison's smile held no warmth. "Because I carried one just like it through 3 tours in Vietnam. Question is, what's a trained killer doing at our little rodeo?" The implications settled over them like dust after a stampede. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "You think he came here specifically? That this wasn't random?" "Nothing about tonight was random," Morrison said slowly. "The way he moved, the way he disappeared, that knife, this was planned." "But Tommy's just a drunk rodeo clown," Hawthorne protested. "Why would anyone target him?" "Maybe they didn't," Martinez suggested. "Maybe Tommy just got in the way." Frank nodded grimly. "That's what worries me. If Tommy was collateral damage, what was the real objective?" Sarah's mind raced through the evening's events, searching for patterns she'd missed. The stranger had arrived alone, kept to himself until the incident with the horse. His reaction had been immediate and visceral, the response of someone who'd seen too much suffering to tolerate unnecessary cruelty. "The horse," she said suddenly. "His reaction started with the horse," Morrison frowned. "Animal cruelty doesn't usually trigger that level of violence." "Unless it's not about the animal," Garrison observed. "Sometimes trauma echoes. Sometimes a man sees one thing and remembers another." The sheriff's radio crackled to life. "Morrison, we've got a situation at the Riverside Motel. Manager found blood in one of the rooms. Guest missing." Morrison keyed the radio. "On our way." He looked at the assembled group. "Frank, take Martinez and canvass the local motels, gas stations, anywhere someone might have seen our stranger. Doc, I need you to examine that motel room." "What am I looking for?" "Anything that tells us who we're dealing with." Morrison's expression was grim. "Because something tells me Tommy Briggs was just the opening act." As they dispersed into the night, none of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows beyond the parking lot lights. The stranger had indeed vanished, but he hadn't gone far. He'd learned long ago that the best way to track hunters was to become the prey, temporarily. His work in Cedar Falls was far from finished. The sheriff's cruiser kicked up a cloud of dust as it pulled away from the rodeo grounds, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and the weight of what he'd just confessed. Deputy Chen had taken detailed notes, her pen scratching across the paper as Marcus laid out the sanitized version of his past, enough truth to satisfy the law, but carefully edited to protect the innocent and bury the darkest secrets. Behind him, the clean-up crew worked to dismantle the carnival atmosphere that had turned so deadly. The bright banners and colorful flags seemed obscene now, fluttering cheerfully over blood-stained dirt where 3 men had fallen. Marcus watched a worker scrub down the announcer's booth, trying to remove the crimson spatters that painted the wooden frame like abstract art. Marcus turned to find a young boy, maybe 8 years old, standing a respectful distance away. The kid wore a miniature cowboy hat and boots, his face streaked with tears and dirt. "You killed the bad men," the boy said simply. Marcus knelt down to meet the child's eyes. "Where are your parents, son?" "Mama's talking to the police lady. She told me to wait by the truck, but..." The boy's lower lip trembled. "I wanted to thank you. They were gonna hurt the horses worse." The innocence in those words hit Marcus harder than any bullet ever had. Here was a child who understood, in the pure way that only children could, the simple arithmetic of right and wrong. 3 evil men had threatened innocent animals, and Marcus had stopped them. No complex moral calculus needed. "What's your name?" Marcus asked. Billy Morrison." "Well, Billy Morrison, you should listen to your mama and get back to that truck." "And Billy?" Marcus placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "The horses are going to be okay. I promise." The boy nodded solemnly and trotted back toward the parking area. Marcus watched him go, then noticed the woman standing near a blue pickup truck. She was watching the interaction with an expression he couldn't quite read, part gratitude, part fear, part something else entirely. Sarah Chen approached from behind, having finished processing the scene. "That was Billy Morrison and his mother, Janet. She's the one who called us about the animal abuse in the first place." Marcus studied the woman by the truck. Janet Morrison looked to be in her 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair and clothes that spoke of hard work and little money. She met his gaze across the distance and offered a small nod of acknowledgement. "She's been fighting this for months," Chen continued. "Trying to get someone to investigate the allegations, filed complaint after complaint with the Rodeo Commission, the State Agriculture Department, even the FBI. Nobody would listen. Until today." "Until today." Chen glanced back at the covered bodies. Funny how a little direct action can accomplish what months of paperwork couldn't. There was something in her tone that made Marcus look at her more closely. The deputy's expression remained professionally neutral, but her words carried an undercurrent of satisfaction that went beyond simple justice served. "You sound like you approve of vigilante justice, deputy." Chen shrugged. "I sound like someone who's tired of watching good people get ignored while bad people run free. Janet Morrison loves animals more than most people love their own families. She's been losing sleep, spending money she doesn't have, fighting a system that doesn't care. And for what? So she could watch those animals suffer week after week?" Marcus understood. He'd seen it before. Good people ground down by systems designed to protect the status quo, forced to watch injustice flourish, while bureaucracy moved at glacial speed. Sometimes the system worked, sometimes it didn't. And sometimes someone like him had to step in and provide a more permanent solution. "The horses will be examined by a veterinarian," Chen continued. "Based on what we've already seen, I expect we'll find evidence of systematic abuse. Janet will finally get the vindication she's been fighting for. And the 3 bodies? Self-defense. Clear-cut. You were protecting innocent animals from documented abusers who threatened you with deadly weapons. The DA might not like the mess, but she's not stupid enough to prosecute a case she can't win." Marcus nodded, but his attention had drifted back to Janet Morrison. She was helping her son into the truck now, but she kept glancing in his direction. There was something in her posture that spoke of decisions being made, internal debates being resolved. As if sensing his scrutiny, she closed the truck door and walked toward him. Her stride was purposeful, determined. When she reached speaking distance, she stopped and studied his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "I know who you are," she said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Marcus felt the familiar cold settling in his chest, the hyper-awareness that came with exposure. Deputy Chen had moved away to supervise the body removal, leaving them alone in a pocket of privacy amid the chaos. "I'm nobody special," Marcus replied carefully. Janet Morrison smiled, but there was no humor in it. "No, you're not. You're Marcus Webb, and I need your help." The abandoned Garrett Ranch sat 15 miles outside Clearwater, its weathered buildings casting long shadows in the morning light. Sarah pulled her cruiser up the rutted dirt road, dust swirling behind her as she parked beside Marcus's truck. The silence felt heavy, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Marcus emerged from the main house, his face grim. "Found something you need to see," he called, gesturing toward the largest barn. Sarah's boots crunched on gravel as she approached. The barn doors hung open, revealing an interior that made her stomach clench. Makeshift pens lined the walls, their floors stained dark, chains hung from the rafters, and in the center sat a concrete ring surrounded by tiered wooden benches. "Jesus," she whispered. "Gets worse," Marcus said, leading her to a smaller room off the main area. Inside, a desk held ledgers, photographs, and stacks of cash. The photos showed men in expensive suits placing bets, their faces animated with bloodlust as they watched unseen violence in the ring below. Sarah picked up one of the ledgers, scanning the entries. "These dates go back 3 years. Look at these amounts. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars." "Miller wasn't just organizing animal fights," Marcus said. "This was a full operation. High-stakes gambling, probably money laundering too. Check this out." He handed her a manila folder filled with bank statements and wire transfer records. The numbers made Sarah's head spin. Money flowing in from accounts across 3 states, all traced back to a network of shell companies. "This is way bigger than Clearwater," she said. "We're looking at organized crime." A board mounted on the wall caught her attention. Pins connected photographs with red string, creating a web of connections. At the center was Miller's photo, but surrounding it were faces she didn't recognize, except for one that made her blood run cold. "That's Judge Harrison," she breathed, pointing to a photograph of the county judge shaking hands with Miller outside what looked like a bank. Marcus moved closer. "And there's Sheriff Kowalski's predecessor, Bill Rawlings, the one who died in that car accident last year." Sarah studied the web more carefully. Names, dates, locations, all documenting a conspiracy that reached deep into the county's power structure. "John was right to be paranoid," she said. "This thing goes all the way to the top." The sound of vehicles approaching made them both freeze. Through the dusty barn windows, Sarah could see 3 black SUVs racing up the access road, their engines roaring. "Back door," Marcus whispered urgently. They grabbed what evidence they could carry: ledgers, photographs, the most damaging financial records, and slipped out through a rear entrance. The vehicle screeched to a halt as Sarah and Marcus crouched behind a rusted water trough, watching armed men in dark suits pour out of the SUVs. "Federal badges," Marcus observed quietly, studying the men through binoculars he'd pulled from his jacket. But something felt wrong. The men moved with military precision, spreading out to secure the perimeter with practiced efficiency that seemed excessive for a simple evidence collection. Their leader, a tall man with silver hair, barked orders in a tone that suggested personal investment rather than professional duty. "They're not here to investigate," Sarah realized. "They're here to clean up." They watched as the men systematically destroyed evidence, feeding documents into portable shredders and using chemicals to eliminate traces of blood and other forensics. Within an hour, the barn that had contained damning proof of a criminal conspiracy looked like nothing more than an abandoned storage facility. Sarah's radio crackled to life. "Unit 7, this is dispatch. Need you to respond to a domestic disturbance on Pine Street." She looked at Marcus, who shook his head grimly. "They're pulling you away on purpose. Someone knows we're here." After the federal team departed, Sarah and Marcus emerged from hiding. The barn had been scrubbed clean, but they'd managed to save crucial evidence. Back in town, Sarah locked the materials in her personal safe rather than the station's evidence room. "We can't trust anyone in official channels," she told Marcus as they sat in her kitchen that evening spreading the rescued documents across her table. "Judge Harrison, probably half the county commissioners, maybe even people in my own department." Marcus pointed to a notation in one of the ledgers. "Look at this entry from 6 months ago. Problem handled, River Canyon. That's where they found that hiker's body, the one ruled an accidental death. How many people have died to keep this quiet?" Sarah wondered aloud. The phone rang, making them both jump. Sarah answered cautiously. "Deputy Chen." The voice was electronically distorted. "Stop digging, or you'll end up like your predecessor. This is your only warning." The line went dead. Sarah set the phone down with trembling hands, meeting Marcus's concerned gaze. "John knew," she said quietly. "He knew all of this, and now they're coming for us." Outside, a car engine started in the darkness, its headlights sweeping across her windows before disappearing into the night. The sheriff's station hummed with nervous energy as dawn broke over Millbrook. Deputy Rachel Martinez had been awake all night, coordinating with state and federal agencies while trying to maintain some semblance of order in a town that felt like it might explode at any moment. Coffee cups littered her desk, and her radio crackled constantly with updates from patrol units stationed throughout the community. Marcus sat in the same chair he'd occupied for hours, his weathered hands folded calmly in his lap. He hadn't spoken since his confession, hadn't asked for water or food or even a phone call. Rachel found his stillness more unsettling than any outburst would have been. This man had single-handedly dismantled the most powerful family in 3 counties, yet he sat there like he was waiting for a bus. The bell above the station door chimed, and Dr. Sarah Chen entered carrying a medical bag and wearing the grim expression of someone who'd spent the night treating more than just physical wounds. She nodded to Rachel and glanced toward the holding area where Marcus remained visible through the open doorway. "How are the injured?" Rachel asked, grateful for any distraction from the weight of the situation. "Stable, mostly. A few broken bones, some concussions. The Caldwell boy will need surgery on his shoulder, but he'll live." Sarah paused, studying Marcus with professional curiosity. "I've been thinking about what happened last night." "About him?" Rachel raised an eyebrow. "What about him?" "I've seen combat trauma before. PTSD, survivor's guilt, the whole spectrum. But this is different. He didn't lose control last night. He made a choice. Every move was calculated, precise. That kind of focused violence doesn't come from a breakdown. It comes from training." Before Rachel could respond, her radio squawked to life. "Deputy Martinez, we've got Agent Torres from the FBI requesting immediate access to the suspect. Says it's urgent." Rachel exchanged glances with Sarah. The federal response had been faster than expected, which meant Marcus's real identity was already sending ripples through law enforcement databases. She keyed her radio. "Send him in." Agent Torres looked exactly like Central Casting would order for a federal investigator. Dark suit, serious expression, and the kind of rigid posture that suggested military background. He carried a thick folder and moved with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to taking charge of situations. "Deputy Martinez, I need to speak with your prisoner immediately. Alone." "He's not talking," Rachel replied, standing her ground. "Hasn't said a word since he confessed to the shootings." Torres opened his folder and extracted a photograph, sliding it across Rachel's desk. The image showed a younger Marcus in military fatigues, standing beside what appeared to be a damaged building in some desert location. "His name is Marcus William Stone, former Special Forces, decorated veteran of 3 tours in Afghanistan. What he didn't tell you is that he's been missing for 2 years." Sarah leaned forward to examine the photograph. "Missing how?" "He was part of a classified operation that went sideways. His entire unit was killed, and he disappeared into the wind. We've been tracking him ever since." Torres retrieved the photo and fixed Rachel with a stern look. "This man is extremely dangerous, Deputy, more dangerous than you can possibly understand. Right now, he's just a man who stopped some animals from being tortured. Rachel replied, surprised by the defensive edge in her own voice. Torres's expression didn't change. Marcus Stone killed 17 Taliban fighters with his bare hands when they overran his position in the Hindu Kush. He survived 3 days alone in hostile territory with a bullet in his leg and shrapnel in his chest. The Caldwells were lucky he showed restraint. The words hung heavy in the air. Rachel found herself looking toward the holding area where Marcus remained motionless, seeing him now through an entirely different lens. The precise way he'd moved, the methodical nature of his actions, the complete absence of wasted motion, it all made sense now. "What do you want with him?" she asked. "That's classified. But I can tell you that his country still has need of his particular skills." Torres closed the folder and straightened his tie. "I'll be taking custody within the hour." "Like hell you will." The voice came from behind them, and they turned to see Judge Patricia Hawthorne entering the station. At 72, she was a force of nature in sensible shoes and a no-nonsense attitude. "Agent Torres, I presume? I've been expecting you." Torres's confident demeanor flickered. "Your Honor, this is a federal matter." "This is my jurisdiction, Agent. Mr. Stone committed his alleged crimes in my county, and he'll face justice here first." She smiled with the kind of warmth that could freeze blood. "I've already scheduled an emergency hearing for this afternoon. Until then, he remains in local custody." The tension in the room ratcheted up several degrees as two very different concepts of authority faced off over the fate of a man whose past was more complicated than anyone had imagined. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Sarah made her way through the gathering crowd. 3 days had passed since the rodeo, and Millbrook felt like a town holding its breath. The emergency town council meeting had drawn nearly everyone. Ranchers clutching coffee cups, shop owners closing early, families with children who whispered questions their parents couldn't answer. Marcus stood near the back of the crowd, his collar turned up despite the warmth. Sarah caught his eye and saw something she'd never noticed before, a wariness that went bone deep, the look of a man who'd spent years watching exits and counting threats. How had she missed it? The way he never sat with his back to a room, how his eyes swept every face in a crowd, the unconscious way he positioned himself to see all approaches. Sheriff Kowalski emerged from the courthouse, his uniform pressed, but his face haggard. The bandage on his forehead was a stark reminder of how quickly their quiet world had exploded into violence. He raised his hands for silence. "I know you all have questions," he began. "I'll tell you what I can. Jake Morrison remains in custody, charged with animal cruelty and assault. Bull Hendricks is in the county hospital, stable but critical. And yes, we're still looking for the man who—" He paused, searching for words. "Who intervened?" "Intervened?" Harriet Clearwater pushed forward from the crowd. "Is that what we're calling it when someone nearly beats a man to death?" Murmurs rippled through the gathering. Sarah found herself stepping forward before she'd consciously decided to speak. "Jake Morrison was torturing an animal," she said, her voice carrying clearly. "In front of children, in front of all of us. And we just stood there. That doesn't justify vigilante justice," Dr. Patricia Wells called out. "I've seen the injuries. Whoever did this has training, military or worse. These weren't the actions of an outraged citizen. They were precise, calculated." Sarah's stomach dropped. She glanced at Marcus, saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Military training, of course. The way he'd moved, the controlled fury, the efficiency of violence, it all made terrible sense now. "The state police are taking over the investigation," Kowalski continued. "They'll be interviewing anyone who was at the rodeo. If you saw this man, if you have any information about his identity or whereabouts, you need to come forward. What if he saved that horse's life?" The voice belonged to Tommy Chen, barely 18, his face flushed with conviction. "What if Jake Morrison would have killed it if nobody stopped him?" "Then you call the authorities," Kowalski snapped. "You don't take the law into your own hands." But Sarah could see the division in the crowd, some nodding agreement, others looking uncomfortable. She'd heard the conversations in her diner, seen the uncertainty in people's faces. Half the town was calling Marcus a dangerous criminal. The other half was quietly asking why they'd all stood frozen while an innocent creature suffered. As the meeting broke up, Sarah lingered, watching the clusters of people form and reform, voices rising and falling in heated discussion. The Brennan family walked past, teenage daughter Emma catching her mother's arm. "Mom, what if the guy who helped the horse is still here? What if he lives here?" Lisa Brennan's face paled. "Don't be ridiculous, honey. Someone like that doesn't just blend into a community like ours." But Sarah knew better. Someone exactly like that could blend in perfectly, quiet, helpful, unremarkable. The kind of man who fixed your fence and refused payment, who knew exactly how much coffee to brew for the morning rush, who remembered everyone's name and never talked about himself. She made her way to the diner, her mind racing. Inside, she found Marcus cleaning tables that were already spotless, moving with that same economical grace she now recognized as something far more dangerous than simple efficiency. "You don't have to say anything," she said quietly, flipping the closed sign and locking the door behind her. "But I need you to know that whatever you were before you came here, whatever you're running from, it doesn't change who you've been to this town." "To me," Marcus set down the cleaning rag, his hands steady. "You don't know what you're saying, Sarah. I know you've never hurt anyone here. I know you work harder than any man I've met and ask for nothing in return. I know you risked everything to save an animal that couldn't save itself." She moved closer, her voice dropping. "And I know you're planning to leave." He didn't deny it. Couldn't, probably. The weight of his secrets was written in every line of his body. "They'll keep looking," he said finally, "and they'll find things. Things that will make you question everything you think you know about me. Then tell me yourself. Help me understand." For a moment, she thought he might. Something flickered in his eyes. Vulnerability, longing, the ghost of a different man he might have been. Then it was gone, replaced by that careful emptiness she'd mistaken for peace. Outside, the town of Millbrook continued its fractured conversations, unaware that the answers they sought stood just beyond their reach, separated by secrets too dangerous to share. The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned rodeo grounds as Jake Mitchell stood among the empty bleachers, his weathered hands gripping the metal railing. 3 days had passed since the confrontation that shattered Millbrook's illusion of safety, yet the echoes of gunfire still rang in his ears. The stranger, David Chen, had vanished like smoke, leaving behind only questions and a town forever changed. Sheriff Morrison approached from behind, his boots crunching on scattered peanut shells and discarded programs. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, testament to sleepless nights spent fielding calls from state investigators, federal agents, and reporters who'd caught wind of the story. "Any word from your contacts in Denver?" Jake asked, without turning around. "Dead end after dead end," Morrison replied, settling against the railing beside him. "It's like David Chen never existed before he walked into our town. The hotel registration was fake, the credit card traced to a shell company that dissolved years ago. Even his fingerprints came back classified." Jake's jaw tightened. "Classified means military or intelligence." "What kind of man were we dealing with, Tom?" Before Morrison could answer, the crunch of tires on gravel announced an approaching vehicle. A black sedan with government plates pulled up to the arena entrance, and 2 figures emerged. The woman wore a crisp navy suit despite the morning heat, while her male companion's casual attire did nothing to disguise the telltale bulge of a shoulder holster. "Sheriff Morrison?" The woman approached with measured steps, her voice carrying an authority that made both men straighten. "Agent Sarah Valdez, Department of Defense." "This is Agent Martinez. We need to discuss David Chen." Morrison's face darkened. Funny how nobody wanted to talk about Chen when he was terrorizing my town 3 days ago. Agent Valdez's expression remained neutral. "Mr. Chen's activities here have raised significant concerns. We understand he neutralized multiple armed individuals and demonstrated exceptional tactical capabilities." He saved lives, Jake interjected, his voice sharp with emotion. Those bastards. We're aware of the circumstances, Martinez interrupted. What concerns us is how Chen acquired his skill set and why he's operating without official sanction. Agent Valdez opened a tablet, displaying a series of surveillance photos. These images were captured by traffic cameras as Chen left Millbrook. Notice anything unusual? Jake studied the photos. In each frame, Chen's posture and movement suggested someone comfortable with being hunted, someone who understood surveillance patterns and blind spots. He moves like a ghost, Morrison observed. Because that's exactly what he is, Valdez confirmed. David Chen is a legend in certain circles, a former special operations asset who supposedly died in Afghanistan 8 years ago. His official records are sealed, but unofficially, he was involved in some of the military's most sensitive operations. The weight of this revelation settled over them like a heavy blanket. Jake remembered Chen's eyes during the confrontation, cold, calculating, utterly without fear. Now it made sense. Why fake his death? Jake asked. Martinez exchanged a glance with his partner. Chen discovered something during his final mission, something that implicated high-ranking officials in war crimes. When he tried to report it through proper channels, attempts were made on his life. So he disappeared, Morrison concluded. Been living off the grid ever since. Until 3 days ago, Valdez added. Your rodeo incident was the first time he surfaced publicly. We believe seeing the animal cruelty triggered something, reminded him of the atrocities he witnessed overseas. A chill ran down Jake's spine as he remembered Chen's reaction to the bull's suffering. The stranger's face had transformed from mild concern to barely contained rage in mere seconds, as if witnessing something that connected to deeper trauma. What do you want from us? Morrison asked. Information, Valdez replied. Did Chen mention where he was going? Any hint about his plans? Jake shook his head, but a memory surfaced. Chen's parting words about animals deserving protection from those who would harm them. At the time, it seemed like simple compassion. Now Jake wondered if it represented something more significant. There's something else, Martinez continued. The men Chen eliminated weren't random troublemakers. Background checks revealed connections to a livestock trafficking operation with ties to organized crime. Chen may have stumbled into something much larger than a simple rodeo incident. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. Millbrook's problems might be far from over. You think he's hunting them? Morrison stated, rather than asked. Agent Valdez closed her tablet with a sharp click. David Chen is a man who's seen too much injustice and lost faith in official channels. He's operating by his own moral code now, and that makes him extremely dangerous to criminals and innocent bystanders alike. As the agents prepared to leave, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. Chen hadn't seemed like a mindless vigilante. His actions suggested purpose, planning, and a specific target. The question was whether Millbrook had been his destination all along, or simply the first stop on a much longer, deadlier journey. The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned livestock pens as Sarah walked the perimeter of what remained of the fairgrounds. 3 days had passed since the shooting, and the place looked like a ghost town. Yellow police tape fluttered in the breeze, marking off sections where evidence had been collected. The blood had been washed away, but the memories lingered in every corner. She found Marcus sitting on the fence rail near where it all began, staring at the empty arena. His left arm was still in a sling, and dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights. When he heard her footsteps, he didn't turn around. Figured I'd find you here, she said, climbing up beside him. Been thinking about what he said. Marcus's voice was hoarse, about how we all just stood there and watched. Sarah studied his profile. The cocky young cowboy who'd been tormenting that horse was gone, replaced by someone who looked much older than his 22 years. You couldn't have known what Wheeler was capable of. Not Wheeler, before that. Marcus finally looked at her. The horse, I was showing off, trying to impress Jenny Morrison, made that animal suffer for my ego. He flexed his good hand. My daddy always said rodeo was about respect, for the animals, for the sport, for each other. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. A pickup truck rumbled into the parking area, and they watched Sheriff Collins climb out. He'd aged a decade in 3 days, the weight of the investigation and media attention pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He spotted them and walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Thought you might be here," he said to Marcus. "Got the preliminary report from the state investigators." Sarah felt Marcus tense beside her. They'd all been waiting for official word about what had happened, though the basic facts were undisputed. Thomas Wheeler had killed 4 men and wounded 6 others before being taken down. What remained unclear was whether he'd be charged with murder or if the self-defense claim would hold. "What's the verdict?" Marcus asked. Collins pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his grey hair. "It's complicated. The first shooting, Billy Rourke, that's clean self-defense. Billy drew first. Multiple witnesses confirm it. The other 3... He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Wheeler's lawyer is arguing temporary insanity triggered by what he witnessed. Says his military record shows severe PTSD from multiple deployments. And you believe that?" Sarah couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "I believe Thomas Wheeler is a man who's seen too much violence and had something inside him break when he saw that horse being mistreated." Collins replaced his hat. "But I also believe he made choices in those moments. Choices that resulted in 3 more men dying." They sat in silence for a moment, watching a hawk circle overhead. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. A man who'd killed to protect an animal had ended up taking human lives. "How's Jenny handling all this?" Collins asked Marcus. A shadow crossed the young man's face. "She won't talk to me. Can't say I blame her. She saw me at my worst that day, then saw what it led to." He shifted uncomfortably. "Her daddy's talking about moving the family to her aunt's place in Colorado. Fresh start, away from all this." Sarah understood. The whole town was grappling with the aftermath. Some folks viewed Wheeler as a hero who'd stood up to bullies. Others saw him as a dangerous killer who'd brought violence to their peaceful community. The truth, like most truths, probably lay somewhere in between. "What happens now?" she asked Collins. "Trial's set for next month. Wheeler's pleading not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. His military records are sealed, but word is he saw some serious action overseas. Lost his whole unit in an ambush in Afghanistan." Collins kicked at a loose stone. "Prosecutors pushing for second-degree murder on the other 3 deaths. Says PTSD doesn't give you license to execute people." Marcus hopped down from the fence, favoring his injured arm. "I keep thinking about something he said to Billy right before the shooting started. Asked him if he'd ever watched someone die, like he knew exactly what that felt like." "Probably did," Collins replied grimly. "Question is whether that makes him more sympathetic or more dangerous." As if summoned by their conversation, a black sedan pulled into the lot. A woman in a dark suit got out and began walking toward them. Even from a distance, Sarah could tell this wasn't someone from their small town. "That'll be Wheeler's lawyer from Denver," Collins said. "Probably wants to interview witnesses again." "Marcus, you sure you don't want legal representation? You were right in the middle of this." Marcus shook his head. "I'll tell the truth about everything. What I did to that horse, how Wheeler reacted, all of it. Maybe if I'm honest about my part, some good can come from this mess." The lawyer was close enough now that they could see her face. Sharp, intelligent, determined. Sarah had a feeling their quiet morning was about to end. The darkness felt different now. Marcus sat in the corner of his cell, back against the cold concrete wall, listening to the sounds filtering through the small window. Sirens had been wailing intermittently for the past hour, and he could hear vehicles moving with purpose through the streets of Cedar Falls. The town was stirring in ways it hadn't in decades. Sheriff Dawson appeared at the bars, his face drawn and tired. The confident swagger from earlier was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like defeat. Behind him stood Deputy Chen, clutching a tablet and looking uncertain. "We need to talk," Dawson said. his voice quieter than before. Marcus didn't move from his position. About what? About who you really are. Dawson pulled up a chair, the metal legs scraping against the floor. Took some doing, but we finally got through to the right people. Turns out Marcus Cole died in Afghanistan 3 years ago. Officially, anyway. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Marcus could see the questions forming in Dawson's eyes, the pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together the way the sheriff had expected. "The name you're traveling under now," Chen interjected, reading from her tablet. "It's clean. Too clean. Like someone with serious resources put it together." "What do you want from me?" Marcus asked. Dawson leaned forward. "I want to know why a dead man is sitting in my jail after taking down 3 armed men like they were children. I want to know why the FBI just called me twice in the last hour asking about you, and I want to know what kind of hell you've brought to my town." Outside, another siren wailed past, closer this time. Marcus could hear radio chatter from the deputy's belt, fragments of urgent communication about roadblocks and surveillance. The net was tightening, but not in the way Dawson imagined. "The people you called," Marcus said finally, "they tell you to hold me?" Dawson's hesitation was answer enough. "They told me to keep you safe. Said there were others who might be looking for you. Bad people. They're already here." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Chen looked up sharply from her tablet, and Dawson's face went pale. "What do you mean?" Marcus stood slowly, moving to the window. Through the bars he could see the main street of Cedar Falls bathed in the orange glow of street lamps. Everything looked normal, peaceful even, but he knew better. He'd developed an instinct for these things, a sixth sense honed by years of being hunted and hunting in return. "The roadhouse where I stayed last night," he said, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "They found it, found the clerk who checked me in. He's dead." Dawson was on his feet now. "How do you know that?" "Because that's how they work. They follow the trail, eliminate witnesses, tie up loose ends. The only reason you're still alive is because they need to know if I'm actually in your custody or if this is a trap." Chen was already on her radio, requesting units to check on the Desert Rose Motor Lodge. Her voice was steady, professional, but Marcus could hear the underlying tension. "Who are they?" Dawson demanded. "What did you do?" Marcus turned from the window, his eyes meeting the sheriff's. "I survived something I wasn't supposed to survive, learned things I wasn't supposed to learn, and instead of disappearing quietly like a good soldier, I decided to make some people pay for what they'd done." "What people?" "The kind who sell weapons to enemies and call it foreign policy. The kind who sacrifice good soldiers to protect bad secrets." Marcus moved closer to the bars. "The kind who torch whole villages and blame it on insurgents." The radio crackled with Chen's voice, requesting immediate backup at the motel. The response came back tense and urgent. "Multiple casualties confirmed. Crime scene is active, requesting additional units, and the coroner." Dawson's hand instinctively moved to his sidearm. "Jesus Christ." "They're coming here next," Marcus said. "Tonight, maybe within the hour. And when they do, anyone who's seen my face becomes a liability. We can protect you. We can—" "You can't protect anyone, Sheriff. Not against these people. They have resources you can't imagine, training you've never seen, and absolutely no conscience about collateral damage." Chen approached the cell, her young face set with determination. "What do you suggest?" Marcus looked at her with something approaching respect. "You let me go. Give me a head start, and maybe some of the people in this town live through the night." "That's not happening," Dawson said firmly. "Then you better start evacuating the downtown area. Get your people as far away from this building as possible." Marcus gripped the bars. "Because in about 30 minutes, this whole place is going to become a war zone." The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Sarah adjusted her blazer and checked her watch. In 30 minutes, the preliminary hearing would begin, and with it, the formal presentation of evidence that would determine whether Marcus Kane would face trial for the deaths of 3 men. She'd spent the night reviewing witness statements, ballistics reports, and the growing mountain of documentation that painted a picture far more complex than anyone in Millbrook had imagined. Sheriff Davidson approached, his expression grim. Judge Harrison just arrived. "You ready for this circus?" Sarah nodded, though her stomach churned with uncertainty. As ready as anyone can be when half the town wants to string up the defendant and the other half thinks he's some kind of folk hero. Speaking of which, Davidson glanced toward the growing crowd gathering beyond the courthouse barriers. "We've got news crews from 3 counties setting up. This thing's gone way beyond Millbrook now." Through the courthouse window, Sarah could see Marcus sitting quietly at the defense table, his hands folded, that same unsettling calm radiating from him that she'd noticed during his arrest. His court-appointed attorney, a young woman named Jennifer Walsh from the county seat, looked overwhelmed by the attention her case had suddenly garnered. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves emerged from a black sedan, her silver hair pulled back severely, her bearing that of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of federal agents. She'd driven through the night after Sarah's call, bringing with her files that could reshape everything they thought they knew about Marcus Kane. "Sheriff Davidson?" Dr. Reeves extended her hand. "We spoke on the phone. I need to brief you both before the hearing begins." They found a quiet conference room where Dr. Reeves spread several manila folders across the table. "What I'm about to tell you is partially classified, but given the circumstances, my superiors have authorized limited disclosure." Sarah leaned forward as Dr. Reeves opened the first file, revealing photographs that made her breath catch. Military personnel in combat gear, faces blackened, eyes hard with the weight of terrible knowledge. "Marcus Kane wasn't just any soldier," Dr. Reeves began. "He was part of a highly classified unit tasked with infiltrating and dismantling human trafficking networks, particularly those involving children. The psychological profile we developed on him after his discharge noted severe PTSD, specifically triggered by witnessing cruelty to the innocent and helpless." Davidson frowned. "So the animal abuse at the rodeo would have been like lighting a fuse," Dr. Reeves confirmed. "But there's more. The 3 men he killed? Bobby Hutchins, Ray Mackler, and Tom Sullivan weren't just local troublemakers. We've been tracking a network that's been moving children through rural communities like yours for the past 18 months. All 3 men had connections to that network." Sarah felt the case shifting beneath her feet like quicksand. "Are you saying Kane knew who they were?" "No, I don't think so. Not initially. But his instincts, honed by years of hunting predators, would have recognized certain patterns of behavior. The way they moved, their reaction to authority, subtle tells that most people would miss." Dr. Reeves opened another file, revealing surveillance photos and financial records. Sullivan had been receiving payments from a shell company we've linked to the trafficking operation. Hutchins had a sealed juvenile record involving sexual assault. Mackler's truck was spotted at 3 different locations where children subsequently disappeared. The conference room fell silent, except for the distant murmur of the gathering crowd outside. Sarah stared at the evidence, her prosecutorial instincts warring with something deeper, more primitive. "This doesn't change what happened," she said finally. "Kane didn't know any of this when he acted. In the eyes of the law, he still committed murder." "Perhaps," Dr. Reeves acknowledged, "but it changes the context significantly. And there's something else you need to know." She pulled out a final photograph, this one showing a young girl, maybe 8 years old, with dark hair and frightened eyes. "Rebecca Martinez, reported missing from a truck stop 60 miles east of here 3 days ago. We have reason to believe she was being transported through this area. If Kane's actions disrupted that network, even accidentally, we might still have a chance to find her." Davidson stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Jesus Christ! You're telling me while we've been focused on arresting Kane, there might be a missing kid out there?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you. And if the trafficking network realizes their local contacts are dead and their operation is compromised, Rebecca Martinez becomes a liability they'll want to eliminate quickly." Sarah felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her shoulders. In 20 minutes she would walk into that courtroom and present evidence against a man who might have inadvertently saved a child's life by taking 3 others. The law demanded justice, but justice, she was beginning to understand, wasn't always found in courtrooms. Outside, a church bell tolled the hour, its bronze voice carrying across a town that would never be the same, regardless of what happened next. The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned rodeo grounds as Jake Matthews stood alone in the center of the arena, his weathered hands resting on the fence rail where it had all begun. The silence felt different now, not the oppressive quiet of a town holding its breath, but something closer to peace. Behind him, footsteps crunched on the gravel. Sheriff Patricia Vega approached slowly, her badge catching the early light. She'd removed her hat, and exhaustion lined her face like a roadmap of the past 3 days. "Figured I'd find you here," she said, stopping a few feet away. Jake didn't turn around. Funny how different a place can look when the smoke clears. The arena still bore scars from that night, burn marks on the wooden chutes, scattered debris that hadn't even been worth cleaning up, dark stains in the dirt that could have been blood or oil or something worse. But without the crowds, without Frank Morrison's presence poisoning everything, it looked smaller somehow, just wood and metal and earth. "Medical examiner's report came in," Vega said. "Morrison's officially ruled a suicide. Gun was registered to him, powder burns consistent with self-infliction, case closed far as the state's concerned." Jake finally turned to face her. "And Caldwell?" "Singing like a canary. Turns out, when you're facing federal charges for money laundering and conspiracy, you get real cooperative real fast. He's already given us 3 other operations in neighboring counties. The FBI's having a field day." A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing across the empty grounds. Jake watched it for a moment, thinking about freedom and captivity, about the strange turns life could take. What about the others? Morrison's crew. Most scattered to the wind the moment word got out their boss was dead. "We picked up 2 trying to cross the border with a truck full of stolen cattle." Amazing how brave men get when they're running scared. Vega paused, studying Jake's profile. "There's something else. Tommy Castellano wants to see you." Jake raised an eyebrow. Morrison's former right-hand man was the last person he'd expected to request a meeting. "He's in county lockup, waiting on his lawyer. Says he's got something that belongs to you." 20 minutes later, Jake sat across from Tommy in the visiting room of the county jail. The man who'd once swaggered around Morrison's ranch now looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 days. His face was pale, his hands shaky. "Never thought I'd be saying this to you," Tommy began, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I owe you one." Jake remained silent, waiting. "Morrison was planning to kill me that night. Found out I'd been skimming money, talking to my cousin about maybe getting out." Tommy's laugh was bitter. "Guess he figured the chaos would be good cover. Make it look like you got me instead of him." From his pocket, Tommy pulled out a small item and slid it across the metal table. It was a silver locket, tarnished with age. "Found this in Morrison's safe when I was cleaning it out for him last week. He said it belonged to some Fed he'd killed years back. Thought you might want it." Jake's hand trembled as he picked up the locket. He knew without opening it what he'd find inside. Sarah's picture, the one she'd worn around her neck the day she'd gone undercover at Morrison's operation, the day she'd never come home. "She was asking questions about the animal fights," Tommy continued. "Morrison got suspicious, did some digging. When he found out she was federal, he—" Tommy couldn't finish the sentence. Jake's fingers worked the tiny clasp. Sarah's face smiled up at him from the faded photograph, frozen in time. On the other side was a picture of their dog, Rex, the German shepherd mix they'd rescued from a shelter, who'd lived to be 15 and died peacefully in his sleep 2 years after Sarah disappeared. "Where?" Jake's voice was barely audible. "Shallow grave up in Devil's Canyon, about 2 miles past the old mining road. Morrison used to joke about it when he was drunk, said she made good fertilizer for the wildflowers." Jake closed the locket carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. For 5 years he'd wondered. For 5 years he'd carried the weight of not knowing, of hoping against hope that maybe she'd survived somehow. Now, finally, he could lay her to rest properly. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Tommy met his eyes for the first time since he'd sat down. "Because some things are bigger than the code. Some things matter more than keeping your mouth shut." He paused. "And because she deserves better than being Morrison's secret." Jake stood slowly, feeling something shift inside his chest. Not healing exactly, but the beginning of it. A loosening of the knot he'd carried for so long. "Thank you," he said simply. As he walked back into the morning sunlight, Jake felt Sarah's presence one last time, gentle as a whisper in the wind. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cemetery as Sarah placed wildflowers on her father's grave. 3 months had passed since that terrible night at the rodeo, and the town of Cedar Creek was slowly finding its rhythm again. The headstone was simple granite, bearing just his name and dates, no mention of his crimes, no judgment carved in stone. "I still don't understand it all," she whispered to the silent earth. "But I'm trying to forgive you." Behind her, footsteps crunched on gravel. She turned to find Marcus Kane approaching, his limp more pronounced in the morning chill. He carried his own bouquet, white roses that seemed to glow against his weathered hands. "Didn't expect to see you here," Sarah said, standing and brushing dirt from her knees. Marcus stopped a respectful distance away. "Your father wasn't all bad, Sarah. Men like him, sometimes they just get lost along the way." She studied his face, noting how the months had softened some of the hard edges. "Is that what happened to you? You got lost?" A ghost of a smile crossed his features. "Something like that." He gestured toward the flowers. "Mind if I—" Sarah nodded, stepping aside as Marcus placed the roses beside her wildflowers. They stood in comfortable silence, two people bound by tragedy and healing. "Sheriff Williams says you're staying," she said eventually. "For now, Doc Henderson needs help at the clinic, and—" Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've been running for so long, I forgot what it felt like to have a reason to stay somewhere." Down the hill, Cedar Creek stretched out before them. New construction had begun where the rodeo arena once stood, a community center this time with plans for a proper animal sanctuary attached. The insurance money from the arena's destruction had been donated anonymously, though everyone suspected the source. "People talk," Sarah continued, "about what you did before, about who you really are." Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What do they say?" "Some say you were military, special forces maybe. Others think you were law enforcement gone wrong. Mrs. Patterson swears you're in witness protection." Sarah turned to face him fully. "I think you were someone who saw too much darkness and decided to do something about it. Does it matter what I was before?" Sarah considered this, watching a hawk circle overhead. "I used to think it did. I used to think people were just good or bad. Simple as that. But you," she shook her head, "you killed people, Marcus. But you also saved that horse. You exposed corruption that might have gone on for years. You protected people who couldn't protect themselves." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was a contractor. Government work, mostly overseas. The kind where you don't ask questions and you don't talk about it afterward. I thought I was doing good, serving my country. But when you're that deep in the darkness for that long—" He trailed off, lost in memories. What changed? A job went wrong. Civilians got hurt because of bad intelligence. A family with kids. Marcus's hands clenched into fists. "I started asking questions then, demanding better intel, better oversight. That made me a liability, so I disappeared before they could disappear me." The pieces clicked together in Sarah's mind. "You've been hiding ever since. Moving from place to place, never staying long enough to matter to anyone or have anyone matter to me." He looked at her with eyes that held both regret and hope. "Until I saw what your father and Hendricks were doing to those animals, something in me just broke. All that training, all that anger I'd been carrying, it had to go somewhere. And now? Marcus gestured toward the town below. Now I'm trying to figure out how to be someone else. Someone better. Sarah reached out and touched his arm gently. You saved us, Marcus. Maybe saving us saved you too. They walked back toward town together, their shadows merging and separating on the dusty path. At the main street, they paused. There's a town council meeting tonight, Sarah said, about the final plans for the community center. They could use your input. I don't really do committees. Neither did I, until recently. She smiled. Amazing what happens when you stop running from things. Marcus watched her walk away, her words echoing in his mind. Stop running. Such a simple concept, but for him, revolutionary. That evening, he found himself sitting in the back row of the community center meeting, listening to passionate debates about architecture and animal care protocols. When someone asked his opinion about security measures, he stood and offered quiet, thoughtful suggestions. Afterward, as people filed out, Sheriff Williams approached him. Good thoughts tonight, the sheriff said. You thinking about staying long-term? Marcus looked around the room, at the faces of people who no longer flinched when they saw him, who'd begun to nod hello on the street. Yeah, he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. I think I am.